For this last section, we'll continue to talk about this relationship between people and the environment in which they inhabit. So, how does non-Western knowledge of nature relate to science? Well, environmental anthropologists recognize that all systems of knowledge about nature are culturally based, even science. And so, when Malinowski and Radin were doing their work, the suggestion that Western culture included non-scientific, magical, and religious elements, and that non-Western societies had elements of science was controversial. In the decade since, however, it's become increasingly obvious to anthropologists that most scientists have scientific attitudes and practices. This original notion that somehow without Western culture, people were less, I don't know, in tune with their surroundings or analytical, or, we have this thing in education here in the US that we talk about how children are natural scientists, yet it would be naive to think that that's not true of children around the world, of children in other cultures. So, um, even indigenous populations that are still living as hunter-gatherers are quite capable of knowing things like weather patterns, climate shifts, both long-term and short-term kind of seasonality and cyclicity, and are capable of quite intuitive observations about the environment that they inhabit. Some of the key differences, though, is that many cultures integrate their science into their spiritual beliefs, social behaviors, and identities, rather than distinguishing it as a special domain of knowledge. So it's a feature or aspect of their culture that's fully integrated in their dominant daily activities. We don't have this strict natural supernatural boundary that Western scientists maintain. And so that brings up this idea of ethnoscience. Ethnoscientists aim to describe and understand the conceptual models and rules with which a society operates. And they begin by comparing the classification systems that are used by different people. So this can be, this is not necessarily like taxonomy, like Carolus Linnaeus and his binomial nomenclature, naming all life with species and genus designation. I mean, this can be classification of living versus non-living, religious versus profane, any way in which people classify their world. In the case of plants and animals, this is called ethnobiology. For example, the Kalam of Papua New Guinea identify the large flightless cassowary as a close cousin of people, but not a bird. They also consider bats, which we know of as mammals, as birds, based on the analogous behavior of flight. So, what is it about the cassowary that's a cousin of people? It's because A, it doesn't have flight, and B, it walks on two legs. So, therefore, according to their ethnoscience, they are similarly classified. WOLA in New Guinea taxonomy is ever changing and even varies between individuals. This emphasis is not on definitively labeling species, but on maintaining communication and discussion of local issues. So their science is tied up with their stewardship, with their conservation, with their maintenance of their relationship with the natural world. Arguments over plant and animal identifications also keep people talking. So there's this constant role of social discussion and negotiation. Indigenous peoples have been shown to possess knowledge of ecological relations that are unknown to Western science. We've got pictures of corn here, or maize, and many of us would recognize this as being the decorative corn that's sold in like craft stores in the fall. But these are varieties of maize that were known to indigenous peoples in the desert Southwest for thousands of years. So, such knowledge often resides in local languages, songs, or specialized rituals, places where scientists don't always think to look. And so, in their ethnobotany and their language distinctions, in the roles in which different natural resources play in their rituals, you may find some kind of symbolic designation, some kind of system of classification. One of the, we've already talked about this notion of the noble savage. So, what type of stewardship or conservation do indigenous populations maintain with their natural world? Well, traditional ecological knowledge is ideal for managing resources because it's customized specifically for particular local environments. And so, particularly in the sense of, let's say, species conservation, maintenance, biodiversity, etc., the people that you should be asking for input on how best to manage these ecologies are the native peoples that have lived there for generations. For example, the Tohono O'odham of the Sonoran Desert distinguish between domestic and wild chili peppers. The wild chili peppers are called bird peppers because their seeds are dispersed by birds. And so, in this sense of domestication of chili pepper species, in this sense of maintaining kind of this balance with the natural world, right? You're going to have different strategies to employ in conservation between domestic and wild species. In Madagascar, the rosy periwinkle plant was used to treat diabetes. Later, this has been found to treat Hodgkin's disease as well. We've got a wealth of ethnomedicine that indigenous people know and have cataloged for generations that could be hiding the cure to cancer, right? And this creates kind of a point of confrontation between local indigenous knowledge and their right to preserve that knowledge in their way of life and overall health and kind of corporate interests. I mean, this is we talked about the Awa and the fact that they've not translated their ethno encyclopedia, their ethnomedical encyclopedia, into Spanish or English, and that's well within their right from the perspective of indigenous property, indigenous intellectual property rights, right? Because as soon as the Awa translate that into either English or Spanish, then there's going to be commercial intrusion. There's going to be exploitation of their natural habitat by pharmaceutical companies, etc. The Zapotec farmers of Oaxaca, Mexico plant specific crops together, building soil mounds to plant maize and letting what we know as the Three Sisters grow together. So the Three Sisters are beans, corn, and squash. You plant the maize that provides the stalk for your beans. The beans fix nitrogen in the soil because of their symbiotic relationship with microorganisms and their root systems, which enables both the squash and the beans to grow. The squash provides some shade to the soil, which allows for lower evaporation, which benefits all three of the plants. And when you combine those three plants together, you actually get a plate of a perfect protein. When you look at the complementary amino acids that each of those components provides. So we're intimately familiar with plant pairings like the Three Sisters. The Zapotec also let plots lie fallow for designated periods of time and would base their crop scheduling on the phases of the moon, which is basically using cyclical kind of seasonal cycles to then be able to time their planting and harvesting. These examples illustrate why environmental anthropologists need to study these models that the insiders use or the native people use to understand how ecological knowledge guides human behavior in particular communities. So as we think critically about ethnoscience, this idea that traditional ecological knowledge provides an effective basis for managing natural resources is resisted by Western agricultural scientists, who frequently dismiss these knowledge systems as not scientific or rigorous. How should we, as environmental anthropologists, respond to these kinds of claims? I.e., does agribusiness know all, right? As large commercial industrial agriculture systems come in and displace indigenous peoples, are we perhaps engaging in um, agricultural practices which are inherently going to harm both the soil, the earth, and the people, right? Is there value in this long heritage of ethno-agricultural knowledge that local people bring to the table? So this noble savage concept permeates conservation. Are industrialized Western societies the only ones that conserve nature, or are native people natural environmentalists? In reality, indigenous people are as susceptible to the risk of overexploitation as any other human group. And so we talked about the Khoisan of southern Africa and the fact that when they were exploiting their 25,000 square kilometers, um, they were not, I mean, they didn't over exploit resources in any one particular area. When things got scarce, they moved on to a new part of their territory. Once they were settled into reservations, they began to hunt giraffes to extinction because They were no longer allowed by the government to follow their territorial nomadic paths. They were no longer allowed to cross the boundaries of four countries. So there's nothing inherently conservationist about either indigenous populations or Western nations. And many landscapes that appear natural to Westerners, sometimes the very landscapes that Westerners want to conserve without people, are actually the result of indigenous involvement and manipulation. Indigenous peoples have been living in tune with their environments for as long as they've been present in any area. And based on their natural foraging patterns, they've shaped the landscape. They've shaped the way in which plants grow. They've shaped the species that are present. So, for example, when British settlers arrived in North America, most didn't recognize that the landscape they encountered was anthropogenic, maintained by indigenous resource management systems to create a sustainable foraging environment. So sometimes this involved plants being intentionally planted in some areas or culled from others. This included rules about what animals were taken when you hunt. If we look at even modern hunting practices, the let's take elk, for example. The bull season is much longer than the sorry, I've totally spaced on the name for a female elk. The cow season. The bull season is so much more crosses so many more months because of the fact that um, you can selectively cull males from the population without limiting their reproductive the population's reproductive potential. If you cull the cows, you're not going to have as many births for the next season. So it can be pretty self-sustaining to selectively thin the herd, targeting specifically prime age adult males. The Tohono O'odham protect rare plants from overharvesting. They transplant individual cacti and tubers to more protected sites and promote the growth of rare plants by pruning them. So even as foragers, we were stewards of the land that we operated. We were anthropogenically shaping the natural landscape. The Maasai, pastoralists of southern Kenya and northern Tanzania, intentionally burn the scrub. What this does is encourages the growth of nutritious pasture grass, which also helps to support wildlife biodiversity, because not only are the cattle that the Maasai herd, not only are they eating this pasture grass, but so too are other grazing animals in this area. Whereas if the bush was left to take over, you end up with more of a scrubland type habitat that doesn't support as much wildlife. So, where then did the Western idea that nature must be empty of people to be pristine originate? There was a push in England for what we call enclosure movements. This is where land was privately owned and rural farmers were evicted from the land, and that land was then used for people, the elites, to be able to hunt on those uh, protected lands. In the 19th century United States, along with westward expansion, the government established formally protected areas that had previously been inhabited by Native Americans. Our entire natural park system, for example, I mean, one of the worst offenses was Mount Rushmore. This was an area in South Dakota that was sacred to the people that were present there. And the mere act of carving the faces of the presidents while creating a national landmark um, really infringed upon the cultural and religious history of the Native Americans that lived in this region of South Dakota. European colonial regimes took over Native peoples' use of natural resources. So, for example, British colonial officials in East Africa created royal game reserves in their colonies, as well as the royal game reserves that were present in their homeland. This was for sport hunting. Natives who used the same land for subsistence hunting were removed and punished as poachers. So, colonial practices have this tradition of removing indigenous populations from their territorial lands that they've had rights to for generations and fencing off or isolating these lands for their own personal use. So this brings the question of, is co-management even possible? Anthropologists recognize that disrupting indigenous people in order to conserve nature is culturally constructed. It's an idea that needs to be reconsidered. Really, what works best for conservation is to enlist the help of local indigenous populations in maintaining biodiversity, species richness, conserving particular species without interfering with their native lifeways, to have them be invested in these conservation issues as well. So there have been some experiments in co-management between international conservation groups and indigenous people. Environmental anthropologists have found that these collaborative approaches create new opportunities for dialogue and shared responsibility between conservationists and indigenous communities. In Rwanda, some of the work that's been done with mountain gorillas is a really good example of co-management. Costa Rica, with their nature reserves, has some very good examples of co-management. Madagascar, um, though it has some failures, also has some very good um, examples of co-management of like local lemur populations and ecotourism and kind of subsistence lifestyles of local people. So there have been some valiant efforts at this co-management idea involving local people, but it's not a perfect solution. Conservation groups still have extensive control despite being outsiders. And there's still this tendency towards a top down approach where local people are told what to do. Some critics also wonder if creating preserves is really a long term solution to the bigger problem, which are the social and ideological factors that contribute to environmental destruction. One of the tenets of like primate conservation is that you cannot reintroduce a species to an area where they formerly lived if you haven't removed the selection pressures that led to their extinction. So if it's a matter of poaching, you've got to have good protections in place before you reintroduce monkeys. If it's a matter of subsistence harming, you've farm or subsistence hunting, you've got to create an alternative food source for the local people before you reintroduce monkeys. So this really needs to be first and foremost in our conservation mindset is alleviating these factors that contributed to overexploitation and destruction in the first place. And so, thinking critically about environmental anthropology, Americans often assume that people are interested in conserving nature, that those people tend to be middle class people who are able to make donations to environmental groups because they have money left over after meeting their basic needs. In other words, protecting nature is luxury, and poor people can't do it because they need to feed themselves. So, based on what we've discussed, why is this view skewed? Right? When you look at the very people who are being removed in these top-down approaches for conservation, right? They are minority populations, indigenous populations, people that live oftentimes in subsistence economies or even poverty. The very people that you need to enlist to have good co-management and have local populations invested in conservation issues are these poor people that may be experiencing food scarcity. So for something to work, it needs to not just be something available to the middle to upper class, right? It needs to not be a luxury. It needs to be a right. Conservation, access to food, access to territorial homelands, these all should be unalienable universal human rights, not simply the rights of the people who've got the greatest economic sway. All right, so how do social and cultural factors drive environmental destruction? Well, environmental challenges are the results of the complex interplay of social, cultural, natural, and political and economic factors. At the heart of this complexity are two questions. The first is how do people consume natural resources? The second is who pays that cost, the cost of that consumption. So, one of the things that's driving global environmental destruction is overpopulation. This has been something debated since Thomas Malthus in the 1700s came up with his theory of modern population demography. Thomas Malthus was troubled by the fact that so many people lived in poverty and that the people who lived in poverty just kept having baby after baby, large families. And he used demographic modeling to convince himself that it was inevitable, that a population's ability to expand is nearly infinite, but the resources to support the population are finite. Therefore, as human populations grow, they will rapidly overexploit the available resources and crash the environment. This is really important to keep in mind with respect to our discussion last week of adaptive strategies because hunter gatherers naturally have relatively small families because they are restricted by their biology. And the kind of caloric ratio of energy output and energy intake is skewed as such that they've got on average about 3 to 4 years between births. When we shift to sedentism and we see a shift towards horticulture, family size increases by about 2 or 3 offspring because you're expending less energy in your travel because you're not nomadic, and because a lot of the vegetable resources that are grown by horticulturalists are readily available weaning foods. That is, it's easier to feed your babies bananas than it is to feed them giraffe meat, right? That shouldn't be surprising given our knowledge about these resources. And so when you start feeding babies weaning foods at younger ages, you cause mothers to start their reproductive cycling sooner. As we shifted to agriculture and had a diet based on grains, we saw an even bigger increase in population size. We saw a population boom because, I mean, think about what the first solid food is that babies in the US are recommended to eat. It's usually rice cereal because it's low in terms of being allergenic. Um, and again, I mean, the sooner that we feed babies solid foods, these weaning foods, the sooner that women resume reproductive cycling. So in this farming kind of, I mean, you think about the old farm families, even in the United States, right? We're talking about 10, 11, 13 children, um, as compared to hunter-gatherer families that only have about five, or horticultural families that have on average about eight. So agriculture came with it explosive population increases. In post-industrial nations, we are currently seeing a decline in the birth rate, but the problem is most of the world is not post-industrial. So while countries like Japan, the US, Italy, Germany, etc., have below replacement fertility, that is an average number of offspring per family unit of only about 1.6, in many of the underdeveloped areas, we are just shifting into um, basically reducing infant mortality, which means that these families that are having 10 to 15 babies, now instead of half of their babies dying, all of their babies are living. So this population boom is coming out of developing countries, not developed countries. All right, so the Malthusian overpopulation concept was dealt with by Paul Ehrlich in his 1968 book, The Population Bomb. The global population more than tripled in the 20th century. We're over 7 billion. We're fast approaching 8 billion. Maybe the coronavirus pandemic will cull a part of the population, but we're still well on target to cross 8 billion within only a handful of years. How do we avoid complete environmental collapse? Well, one solution is to adapt a landscape's carrying capacity. What does this mean? Well, in biology, there's a concept called carrying capacity, which is the population size that an environment can support, kind of the max population levels. And when you've got complex ecosystems, you see cycles. So one good example was in southern Canada. There's the lynx and the rabbit cycles. What do rabbits eat? They eat grass. So in a wet year, the grass there's a burst in the rate of grass reproduction. There's a lot of grass, basically, really nutritious grass. The rabbits eat that, and displaced by just a few weeks, then the rabbit populations have a boom. Their numbers increase. What that does then is gives more food for young lynx who are just learning how to hunt. So displaced in time from that rabbit boom comes the lynx boom, which then is going to drive a crash in the rabbit cycle, which then resultantly, after a temporal delay, will drive a crash in the lynx cycle. This cyclical baby boom and then bust of populations is pretty typical when those populations are naturally managed. One of the problems for humans is that we adapt technology to be able to artificially increase the carrying capacity. So we would have been a very part of this natural seasonal, yearly cycle when we were living as hunter-gatherers. But once we started intentionally cultivating plants and animals, we were able to increase our population density. We were able to grow our populations. But as we grew our populations, we increased our reliance on these domesticated plants and animals. We increased our reliance on technology to increase the carrying capacity. So how can we increase the Earth's carrying capacity? Well, one way is through technology and landscape modification. Here in this picture, we have a forest savanna mosaic. Maintaining forested areas in the midst of savannas is good, and kind of cycling through, clear some areas of forest, slash and burn, um, dig those nutrients into the soil, but then areas where you've previously farmed, let those areas lie fallow. This horticultural model of land management is actually inherently good, and we have a lot that we could learn from small scale horticulturalists in how we manage our land. The way that we go about agribusiness is not the way to increase our carrying capacity. Interestingly, we don't actually have a global food production problem. What we have is a global food distribution problem. And so, in areas where the population is growing rapidly, we don't distribute resources equitably enough to support that growing population. Whereas in areas where reproduction has declined, let's say the United States, we throw out an obscene amount of food, blemished produce, leftovers in restaurants, etc. And so, if we could just orchestrate a better system of distributing food resources around the world, we would do a lot in terms of equity, poverty, human health. All right, so this brings us to the concept of ecological footprints. In general, in industrialized countries, we've got bigger ecological footprints. So Americans only make up 5% of the world's population, but they consume 25% of its resources. This is not sustainable. What's driving this? Part of it is our reliance on fossil fuels. Okay, fossil fuels are non-renewable. So as we base our driving on petroleum products, fossil fuels, we're using those up. We're also contributing an obscene amount of pollution to the global atmosphere. Um, so this is true across all industrialized nations, that the biggest offenders in terms of the largest ecological footprint are these industrialized nations. Manufacturing burns fossil fuels. Our reliance on technology, I mean, the copper mines are incredibly exploitative, yet we use copper wire in most of our electronics. The lithium that's mined for lithium cadmium batteries, that's destructive. There are a lot of things. I mean, just even think about almonds or cashew production, right? We think of going to the store and buying a big bag of almonds or cashews. We don't think about the apricot-like fruit that the almond is inside of, or the cashew, quote unquote, it's called a cashew apple. It looks a little bit like apples, but the cashew grows kind of at the top of the apple. Incredible amounts of waste just for our bag of nuts. So, and then packaging and such. When we have packaging and stuff, when we order something from Amazon, right, it comes in a huge box with what used to be styrofoam peanuts. Now we've got uh, those air packets that are plastic. So even just reducing our packaging would go a long way to kind of lessening our ecological footprint. Environmental anthropology is also associated with political ecology. Political ecologists explore how impoverished people can knowingly overexploit natural resources. And often people are motivated by their marginal position in unequal social and economic systems. So they want to overexploit, particularly when the overexploitation brings them economic gain. So these copper mines, these lithium mines are good examples of that, where marginalized people then take on the roles as employees. They take the roles of the miners because the mining companies pay them more money than their crops could earn, for example. All right, so this brings then, as kind of our last point, environmental justice. Political ecologists have also observed that environmentally harmful activities fall disproportionately on lower income people and minority groups. Historically, Black communities, Hispanic communities, Native American communities. One solution is seeking environmental justice. So, for example, this protest in Warren County, North Carolina, it didn't prevent the opening of a polychlorinated biphenyl landfill site or a PCB landfill site. But it did inspire others around the country to recognize and challenge situations of environmental discrimination. So when we look at mining towns, for example, though mining brought a lot of wealth into the community, that wealth was concentrated in the hands of the mine owners, not the people working in the mines. And so um, when those mines pull out, people are left behind living basically in squalor and extreme poverty. When we think about contaminated sites, we've got this phrase, not in my backyard, NIMBY. Um, Typically, white, well to do people can gather enough support and political power to make sure that toxic sites aren't built right in their backyard. Lower income areas can't mount that same kind of political or economic support. So if there's a Superfund site nearby, you're more likely to be minority. Heck, I mean, think about the water in Flint right now, right? The bulk of the people that haven't been able to relocate out of Flint and may or may not be able to afford bottled water are racial minorities and typically low socioeconomic status. So it's poor Black families in Flint that are bearing the brunt of the cost of that contaminated water. And so, in the recent years, environmental anthropologists have turned their attention to social and cultural dimensions of climate change. One of the things that anthropology has to offer is this holistic perspective. Um, this holistic perspective understands climate change as one of a number of environmental influences on people's social lives. It is not the single variable driving environmental change in the world today. And so there's been some new ethnographic fieldwork that is focused on the social complexities surrounding the production of knowledge about climate change. Ethnography has also been used to show that different societies have different ways of conceptualizing it and then dealing with climate change and climate variability. A one size fits all approach is not going to work, right? I mean, Greta Thunberg did phenomenal work in like bringing attention to our climate problems, but we can't have a one size fits all solution. We need to be mindful of people's lifestyles, of people's culture as we work towards slowing at least climate change. And so, thinking critically then about anthropology, environmental anthropologists reject population growth as a singular cause of environmental degradation around the world. But there are conditions in which population growth can play a role in environmental degradation. What kind of conditions do you think those would be? Well, some of those would be transitions from one adaptive strategy to another. As we shift, for example, from horticulture to agriculture, we stop letting fields lie fallow, right? That's going to contribute to forest clearing, that's going to contribute to the land being stripped of resources without having time to replenish it through this fallow period, right? Industrialization is also a big driver of climate change and the shift to being kind of a modern post industrial nation. So perhaps we need to rethink the way that we kind of monitor and tax multinational corporations. Perhaps we need to hold corporations to an ethical standard in the way they treat the environment, but also the way they treat the people that they exploit, right? So think about that and come up with some creative ways that you think we could maybe more successfully tackle climate change.